Hey, School Bus here. So, you want to live stream. You've got that new $2,000 computer, you got some cool new games, you want to jump onto Twitch or onto YouTube Gaming, and you want to share it with your friends. Well, that should be really easy, right? You go download OBS, you set up some basic things, you hit stream now, and boom, you've got yourself a live stream. And technically, yes, it's that easy. You can go get other information from a lot of other sites that will get you set up to be able to get your stream going. But how good will it look? Will it have pixelation? Will it be at 60 frames per second? Will it be at 30 frames per second? And what resolution should you use? What's the optimal? Is streaming at 4K the best looking image you're going to get? If these are some of your questions, you might want to stick around. We're going to go through and look at a little bit of the science behind this, of what are the actual parameters given to us by YouTube Gaming and Twitch. And then once we have that information, how do we make use of it to figure out for our particular setup what's optimal? How do we measure success? So, stick around. I think you're going to learn something. Alright, so first things first, let's go figure out what the parameters are that we have to work with. And here on the screen, I have the website up for YouTube. And if you just go type in YouTube streaming settings, you'll find this. If you go type into Google Twitch streaming settings, you'll get this one on the right. And I want to call out a couple of key things here. One is YouTube has far more options in terms of what resolutions. And in addition to that, you will see that 1080p 60 frames per second, that's the cutoff on Twitch. YouTube Gaming, you can go up to 1440p. You can do that at 30 or 60 frames per second. And the same is true for 4K. You can do those at 30 or 60 frames per second. Now, what's very interesting is when you dig into these individual ones. So let's look at 1080p, 60 frames per second. You can stream up to a 9,000 kilobits per second, or 9 megabits per second stream to YouTube. To Twitch, you can only do 6,000. And what this means is that you are going to have more pixelation at 1080p 60 frames per second on Twitch than what you would on YouTube Gaming. All other things being equal. There could be things behind the scenes at YouTube or at Twitch that complicate this, but going by the numbers, that's what that means. And it's true at all of the different settings. You will have more bitrate options for YouTube than you will with Twitch. YouTube will allow you to send it more data. Knowing that, this is why I tend to use YouTube almost exclusively. I don't have a huge following base on either platform, but especially not on Twitch. And I just don't necessarily want to compromise on image quality. That is first and foremost for me as far as the content that I create. So I'm going to, from this point on in the numbers we go through today, I'm going to be focused on what are the maximum allowables at 2K or 1440p and 1080p on YouTube. So let's go take a look at that. Alright, so me being me, I put all of this into a spreadsheet. And I took the information from YouTube Gaming and I loaded that in here. This is just the descriptive data of what's the resolution, how many frames per second. We'll get back to this compression ratio later. The maximum and minimum bit rates. And then I calculated how many pixels per second need to be processed. And this is just simply taking the resolution of the monitor, 2550 times 1440, and then multiplying by 60 when it's 60 frames per second, and multiplying by 30 when it's 30 frames per second. And that's the number of pixels in a second that the encoder is having to translate into what becomes the upload stream to YouTube. And where this becomes important is when we make this graph below, and these plots are basically the same thing, but looking at it slightly different. Different brains will probably associate more or less with one or the other. I'm going to start with the one on the right. And this simply shows bar graphs of the maximum allowable and minimum allowable upload stream rates to YouTube. And then the right-hand axis is for this gray line that shows what is that number of pixels per second that a given resolution is going to have. As this gray line is relatively higher than the blue bar, that indicates possibly there's going to be more pixelation there because there's more pixel information, relatively speaking, than some of these other bars that the line is actually below it. So if we interpret this quickly, we can see that at 1440p 60 frames per second, we're kind of at parity there. That for this relative example, it's equal. Then when we jump down to the 1440p 30 frames per second, we see that the blue bar is a lot higher than the gray. This tells me actually I may have better image quality because YouTube is still giving me a lot of bit rate, but the number of pixels required to process is actually a lot less. So I may actually have less pixelation. Then we jump over to 1080p 60 frames per second. Now this goes decidedly the other way. There's a lot of pixel information, but we don't necessarily have as much relative bitrate. And then 1080p, we kind of see again an improvement where it's a little bit below the line. Now, one caveat to this is this compression ratio I talk about here in column D. And this has to do with when you move from 30 frames per second to 60, it doesn't double the data requirement of the stream. And it has to do with when you're simply grabbing twice as many snapshots, if you will, of the game you're playing, not all of the pixels change between each one of those captures. And as a result, the pixels that stayed in place, the encoder is going to know that, and it's going to take advantage of the fact that it just has to say, oh, this pixel didn't move, don't worry about it. And because of those efficiencies, you don't need as much bit rate. So if we jump over to the graph on the left, this is showing the result of the equation on the right. And it's basically saying that as those lines are higher on the page, we have less image quality, and as the lines are lower on the page, we have better image quality. And the dashed line is indicating this conversion, saying that, you know, at 60 frames per second, I probably don't need to double the effective pixel processing rate in the stream, in which case you begin to see this flatten out, and it generally says that, yes, YouTube gaming is allowing you more image quality for a 1440p stream than it does for a 1080p 30 frame per second stream. There are going to be other complications to that, namely being you have to process twice as much information with your encoder when you go from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second. And if you have to lower your encoding quality, moving, using OBS terms, moving from, say, medium to fast, faster, or very fast, I think I got that right, that's going to lower the image quality as well, in theory. So you do have some balancing factors here. But strictly speaking about pixelation and minimizing it, I would say that what I just walked through there is going to be true, and that these charts do give us a bit of an indication of what that looks like. These charts also give you, particularly on the right-hand side, a way to see, okay, what range of upload speed do I need to achieve? And obviously, many of us are going to look at this and say that we don't have the upload speed to be able to maintain a minimum of 9,000 to be able to do a 1440p 60 frame per second stream. So immediately we're going to have to move down that scale to something lower. The other limiting factor will be hardware, and we'll see some of that here in a bit in some of the examples. So there was the boring part. We had to go through and talk about some numbers. Now let's go actually look at some of the results from the videos that I captured. So for the tests, I'm using the Threadripper 1920X, that has 12 cores, 24 threads, the GTX 1070 Ti NVIDIA graphics card, a 32 gig G.Skill 3200 megahertz memory package in the Threadripper, and then the AverMedia Live Gamer 4K capture card is being used for the capture card segments, and then OBS using the faster encoding setting, unless I note otherwise. So now let's look at these individual videos. First here we have the comparison of 1080p, and you have 60 frames per second on the left and the 30 frames per second on the right at their respective maximum allowables. Overall here, I see advantages with the 60 frames per second. It's smoother. I don't notice an appreciable larger amount of pixelation with it, so I'm really happy with it. At 1080p, I would go for 60 frames per second so long as my encoder could keep up. Now jumping to 1440, this is where it's much more important what your hardware can do. 60 frames per second is a lot of information to process, let alone uploading at that 18,000 setting. And again, I generally like the way the 60 frames per second looks. You did see a little hiccup there. That was an anomaly. It just happened that the cut of this I ended up using had that. I did not normally have any hiccups with the images at that resolution. Now, in reality, most nights I need to throttle back to about 15,000 for an upload stream rate. And so I wanted to see what that looked like. And particularly, I wanted to see what it looked like using the X264 preset as opposed to the NVENC. I like the way the 264 looks. You could argue the NVENC is a little bit sharper, but I saw weird artifacts in the sky and sometimes in the trees, so I didn't prefer it as much. Alright, so there we established what the options are and how we can upload to YouTube or Twitch for that matter. Now, let's talk about some of the best practices, how we can define and measure success, and how can we optimize this where it's looking really good. Alright, so if you're anything like me, you like to be able to define success and to make sure that you've optimized whatever it is you're working on. And I'm going to show you how to do that with OBS. So with OBS open, if you go up to Help, Log Files, Show Log Files, you'll be able to see the listing of the different log files that it's created. And I have an example here on the screen. Let me get that out of the way. And as you scroll down through this document, you'll be able to find where you stopped your stream, and after it, it will give you a report. Now, if the report doesn't have these 3 lines I'm going to walk you through here, that means there were no errors. It will just tell you here's how many frames it outputted, here's how many it drew, and that's it. If you did have any issues, you will see the following entries. Number of lagged frames due to rendering lag stalls. This is when your video card isn't passing the information over to the encoder quick enough. So if the video card is so busy delivering all of the frames for your game, it isn't going to have enough bandwidth to also be able to provide reliably the frames over to the encoder. And typically, if you don't have VSync turned on or capping your frame rate somehow, this is what's going to happen. The next one is the insufficient bandwidth connection stalls. This is only going to happen when you're streaming, and this has to do with when you just aren't getting enough upload speed. There might be something with your ISP or something on YouTube's end that's happening, or possibly something with your local area network. And then last is skipped frames due to encoding lag, and that's when the encoder itself is the problem. So if you're using the X264 preset, that means that your CPU is falling behind, or if you're using the NVENC or whatever AMD's equivalent one is, I can't recall it right now, it could be the video card again not being able to encode fast enough. Do note, the encoding lag on NVENC isn't very common because that's really efficient. Rarely is it going to be your issue. So anyway, these are the 3 failure modes that you can have, and if these percentages get too high, you'll start to notice something going wrong. So if you're suspicious, use the log file. This will be able to tell you if you're having an issue, and then if you are, where is it? And again, to get rid of these rendering lag stalls, make sure you're using VSync. You're doing something to restrict the usage of the video card. And if I look here quick, pull up Task Manager. So if you right click down in the Start menu bar, you can bring up the Task Manager. In there, there's Performance. at least in Windows 10, it will give you the GPU usage. If this gets above 95% or so, you're going to start to see problems in your encoded video, or there's a good chance of it. If you don't have this type of task manager that'll show this to you, you can also use the GPU usage that's either in the game or in Precision OC. If you're using EVGA or MSI Afterburner, you can look at that usage as well. So that's how you determine success. The other thing I want to talk about is at the very top header of this, it talks about the Windows 10 gaming features, and it has this game bar and game DVR. You want to make sure that these are off. Mine weren't until recently when I learned about this trick. You go into the start menu and you type in game bar, click on game bar settings and turn it off. And this just saves your, not your CPU, but your GPU some usage that it is having to worry about providing information to this, and it just takes up resources that if you're not using this, just turn it off. If you are using it, so be it. Keep using it however you are. All right, I think that covers this section. Let's move on. So one of the hidden things that you need to make sure you have set right for recording or live streaming is if you have multiple displays, you need to make sure the refresh rates are set identically on all of them. If you only have one display, that's not going to be a problem, obviously. But there's two ways to do it. One is if you have either NVIDIA or the Radeon control panel, you can bring that up, and in there you can click through your different ones and just make sure each of your monitors, each of those outputs, the refresh rate's the same. Typically 60 Hertz is the best way to do it, because that way at 60 Hertz you are producing the same output as if you're doing 60 frames per second. That's what 60 Hertz and 60 frames per second are the same thing. And then if you were to do 30 frames per second, it's exactly half, so it scales well. It is worth noting, assuming you have a lot of video card and you're able to do all of the things we previously talked about not overloading it, you could potentially do like a 1080p signal at 120 Hertz, and you could then divide that by 2, do your 60 frames per second, then divide that by 4 and be down at your 30 frames per second. So 120 would be another magic number, but you have to make sure you have enough video card to be able to push that at whatever resolution you are at. The other way to confirm your refresh rates is to go into the display settings. So if you go right click on the background, hit display settings, get into the advanced display settings, then you can say down here at the bottom, you can click where it says display adapter properties for whichever display it is you're looking at. You can choose between them, and then it will bring up this menu here. I think it defaults to adapter. You click on monitor, and then you can choose your refresh rate. Obviously, it's a lot easier getting at it through the NVIDIA control panel than what it is to do it through Windows. So anyway, that is how you synchronize your refresh rates. Very important. You will see a lot of GPU usage wasted if you have varying refresh rates between your monitors. This is a big impact. One quick tip while we're looking at OBS is you can greatly reduce your GPU usage by turning off the preview. And now obviously you don't have the preview anymore. You want to do this after you've set up your scene, you've got everything where you want it. Turn off that preview and you'll save yourself some GPU usage. We'll see that in my example here in a little bit. Alright, let's take a brief moment here to talk about capture cards. So, I'm going to show you in a moment what happens with and without a capture card when you're pushing the envelope. And what happened to me was I had plans of doing 2K video at 60 frames per second, but I had problems. I would get this weird stuttering thing, and it ultimately turned out to be when your video card is overtaxed, it can't pass the images reliably over to the encoder, and as a result you get this weird tearing effect. Well, you'll see it in a minute. But what you can do is you can get a capture card, and this here is the AverMedia Live Gamer 4K, and it's about $100 cheaper than Elgato, and probably it's more likely you've heard of Elgato, but these guys are actually more in the professional segment, and they happen to have some cards that are down in the consumer grade segment, this being one of their best examples. But shop around, you can find what you need. Obviously, if you're not doing 4K, you don't really need 4K. In doing 2K, you kind of get hosed like I did. They don't really make things that are for 2K. It's either 1080p or they jump straight to 4K. The advantage is at 2K, I can capture at 144 hertz. But yeah, I can't quite push 144 hertz with my 1070 Ti. So, capture card does give you more options with very few drawbacks. You also have the ability to capture from other devices like a console, another PC. Ideally, what I could be doing right now is I could be gaming on one PC and then I could be capturing on a different one. I'm just using one machine. My Threadripper machine is both what I'm gaming on, and then it's looping the signal back into it, and then it's encoding there. And it works pretty well. Let's take a look. Alright, now let's test out some of these different settings, and I want to show you what the failure modes look like and then what I did to correct them. So first off here, we are just using the game capture in OBS. This is a 15,000 Mbps capture to a local file. So I'm trying to simulate the stream and what that would look like. It's using a faster encoder loading. It is the X264 preset, and then I'm also running a custom tune in the encoder, and I will post that in the description below. It's one that works really good for first-person shooters that have a lot of detail. If you're playing something like League of Legends or CSGO or something like that, you don't need to run this one, or you need to go find a different one. But for something with a lot of detail like Division 2, it works really well. It also works really well for World of Tanks. So now, I'm going to start moving around here. And what you're going to see is that it is going to be tearing a fair amount, and it's not going to be glassy smooth. So, what would be the solution? Well, I could turn down my detail settings. I could especially turn down, most importantly, my refresh rate from 60 to 30, or I could drop down to lower resolutions, do 1080p at 60 frames per second or 1080p at 30 frames per second, and then that would correct the problem. Now, the other thing I can do is simply use a capture card. So now watch this. I will go out here. I will change my scene from using the game preset to the capture card, and you can see now it is just replicating what's coming through on my main display. And now, as I move around, I do not have the same tearing issues and problems that I had previously. However, I am having input lag problems, and that's where it comes in to turn off the preview. So now I'll turn off the preview, and now you will notice that my GPU usage, see where it was spiking at 100%? Well, now it's not anymore. And with that, I don't have input lag, which is very bizarre. Yes, with video capturing, you can end up with terrible input lag when you overload the GPU. And so now you can hear me clicking my keys and see that my character is immediately reacting to those. Now, watch, if I go back in, I turn back on the preview, and I come back in here, look at the way that GPU usage spikes way up. And for that matter, actually the CPU usage goes up quite a bit as well when the, at least when the lag spikes are occurring. And now I'll go back out, turn off the preview, and here we go. And yes, I do have my refresh rate synced. That issue does not exist here. All those other optimizations that I've recommended to you have taken place. So, I hope this helps you a little bit in diagnosing any potential issues you are having with your particular setup, both when you're recording or streaming. I know a lot of this video has been about streaming, but this applies to recording as well. So there you go. This has been School Bus's conveyance of knowledge that he learned while going through and getting my own setup optimized. I'm hoping this helped for you. Probably not all of that was new and useful information, but hopefully bits of it were. And I applaud any of you who started at the beginning and you made it all the way through till now. You should get some sort of a prize. I just don't actually have anything really available. So if you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. Also check out some of my other videos on encoding and some of the other things I've learned in this space. I'll link some of them to this video, but you can also check around, browse around the channel and find more of those as well. This is something that I keep revisiting as I run into my own challenges, and as I learn things, I will try and pass those along to you because I'm School Bus. So thanks for watching. Take it easy. Have a great day.